Hello, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College, and in association with our friends and partners, IFC Films, and also our partners, New York Film Academy here in New York and in Los Angeles. Welcome to the FOLCS film series. Tonight's film, a new documentary that opens nationwide this Friday, and it'll also be available on demand on Friday. It's called Unstuck in Time. For those of you who are Kurt Vonnegut fans, you may remember that is a phrase that's used repeatedly throughout Slaughterhouse-Five. And I guess not surprisingly, this is a documentary about Kurt Vonnegut. It is directed by Robert Weide, who many of you may know is an award-winning, Emmy Award-winning director for Curb Your Enthusiasm. What you may not know is that he's also an accomplished documentary filmmaker and has made films about iconic comedians, whether it was the Marx Brothers or Lenny Bruce or Mort Sahl or Laurel and Hardy. And we're going to talk about this film, his latest, and what makes this very different for him. In part, I think it's because it's in some ways a love letter. It's in some ways a buddy film. In some ways, it's like Field of Dreams, and he'll explain a little about this, but he had virtually a lifelong friendship with Kurt Vonnegut that began when he was a young filmmaker. And this film has been in the works for many, many years. And Bob has been filming Vonnegut and friends and family for many, many years. So this is really a comprehensive look at Vonnegut's life, his work, his psychological complexity, his family dynamic. And you know what? It's also a film about Bob Weide in a way. So we'll get to that in a moment. If you're watching us live on Facebook, welcome. We enjoy having you. Please go to folks.org and sign up for our email list. If you have a question for Bob, you can put it in the Q&A box and hit send, and maybe we'll get to it at the end of the night. And so let's start. Bob, welcome to FOLCS.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Now, this is a terrible way to start off the conversation, but I have to give you a correction right up front. Introduction was beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, I can see a cat bed behind me. Look at that. But there's no cat in it. Yes, I covered all those subjects you mentioned, except for Laurel and Hardy, whom I adore, but I never made a Laurel and Hardy doc.
What film am I thinking of?
You're probably thinking of W.C. Fields.
Oh, I'm thinking of W.C. Fields. Sorry, you're right. Thanks.
That's okay.
Yeah,
all great.
Yeah, no, good correction, good one. It also gives you a sense of where your head is at. Yeah, of course, W.C. Fields would have come first.
I just don't want anybody to say, why are you taking credit for a film you never made?
Yeah. So, Bob, you're in this film of yours, you come across as quite modest. Nobody would think that you were taking credit for anything you hadn't actually done on your own. That's let's just start. First of all, you co-directed this film, and I wonder whether it's because you're in some ways a subject of the film, and so therefore there was some thought that you needed to get some distance. Am I right, or was some other reason? Because the co-director didn't seem to have this long-standing relationship with Vonnegut. This relationship is something that you developed over decades.
Well, yeah, the film, from the time I first wrote Vonnegut asking for authorization for me to make this film until now, has been 39 years. Don Argett, a wonderful documentary filmmaker, has been involved only for 6 years. So just a little, just short
perspective.
Blink of an eye. No, well, you've got it mostly right. Is, when this started off, the idea was to do just a fairly conventional kind of author documentary, the type of thing you'd see on American Masters on PBS. And that was the idea when I wrote to Vonnegut. Now, from the time I wrote to him until I started filming was 6 years, just because it took me that long to get any money, any financing to get started. And then it became, there was never really any financing for the film other than what was out of my own pocket. So it became sort of like a hobby project that was just on and off for many years. Now, Kurt died in 2007. And as you've indicated, what happened during that time, those 25 years from 82 to 2007, is we became very close friends to the point where while I was making the film, I was kind of worried about that in terms of, how that would affect, not it's not like journalistic integrity so much, because it's not like it would be a controversial subject, but in terms of full disclosure, in other words, I started off making a film about a favorite author of mine, my very favorite author. And now I was making a film about a friend of mine, and I wasn't quite certain how that would impact the film or if it should. And then after Kurt died and the film was sitting around for a while, and I wasn't quite certain how to move forward, a couple of people who were actually mutual friends of mine and Kurt's said, well, the story about how you wrote a letter to your favorite author, and during the course of, you know, the struggle to make this film, this wonderful friendship evolved as you continue to struggle to make the film. The suggestion was that that story should be folded into the documentary because that was an interesting story. I was skeptical about it. I really did not want to go on camera, but it did seem the only way to sort of dig myself out of this hole. And it did seem that would be a way to sort of fully disclose.
It's a storytelling device.
Exactly. Well, that's what it became. And then once that decision was made, the first thing I thought was, well, I'm not going to interview, if I'm going to go on camera, I'm not going to interview myself. And I'm not going to I'm not going to direct a film crew to follow me around as I'm transferring film.
You become both director and analyst, someone who has something interesting to say about Vonnegut. So in a way, you became one of them. So you needed another director.
So I actually become a talking head in the movie.
Yes.
So then I thought, well, maybe, you know, I need to bring in another documentary filmmaker who can then focus on this kind of meta element within the film. Well, I continue to focus on the Vonnegut biography. And I met Don actually at a film festival in Kiev, Ukraine, of all places. We hit it off, and he was a Vonnegut fan.
So he was the perfect person. Yeah.
Yeah. And I asked him to come in and do this. And so the end result is kind of a hybrid between, you know, what he does well and what I do well.
So the title, Unstuck in Time, is interesting because when I think about what Vonnegut says in Slaughterhouse-Five about Billy Pilgrim, is that what we're doing is we're skipping all the details of life, and we dispense with, you know, the mundane, the ordinary, and the monotonous, and we simply go to the highlights. And so throughout the novel, you know, Billy Pilgrim shows up at really, iconic moments of his life, including, you know, back and forth shifting in time, goes to another planet. But in this film that you make, it's interesting because it's sort of a misnomer, because you have Vonnegut very much stuck in time. Your friendship with him is granular. You know, you pin him down in a way that Billy Pilgrim doesn't get pinned down. And you get involved in, I would say, sort of the messy details of life, you know, the in between the highlights in an enormously interesting way, right? You surround the film with his family and some of his colleagues and other writers and critics, and of course, one of the directors, you. You know, I wonder whether the whole time that you were thinking, I'm really putting Vonnegut on the couch.
No, it's not what was on my mind so much, but the Unstuck in Time, you know, Billy Pilgrim in Slaughterhouse-Five lives his life not in a linear fashion, but at random moments. So he might be an old man 1 minute, the next minute a young boy, middle-aged, then he's back in the war, and then he dies, and then he's back again in childhood or whatever. And that structure to some degree informs the documentary, in that it starts off with Vonnegut. When I first filmed him in '88, he would have been in his I guess mid-late 60s. And then we go to his boyhood home in Indianapolis, where he grew up as a young boy, and we see footage of him as a young boy, and then we have him back as an old man. And then
so you really do have him unstuck in time, right?
Yeah, we move around. And then what's odd is once I enter the film, then I sort of become unstuck myself, because I'm in the film at my current age, which is 62, and then I'm reminiscing about filming with Vonnegut, and then we see me with him in 1988 when I'm in my 30s, early 30s, or whatever it is, mid 30s, and so we're both sort of floating around at random as we're both
Right.
reviewing points in our life that are all over the place. And
But unlike the novel, right, you've really, what I meant by being stuck in time is sort of the pinning him down as to getting in, unlike Billy Pilgrim, where, you know, it's for the purpose of a plot device that he pops up at various different points. You know, what you did is got, you know, the actual life of what started out as a struggling novelist, and took him through his family and his childhood and some of the traumatic moments of his life. I mean, you did something here that he wouldn't have done in any way in a novel or a memoir, which is that you really told this story, and you did it in a detailed way.
I think one of the advantages, aside from the personal advantage for me, getting to be friends with him and to log so much FaceTime with him, one of the advantages to becoming as friendly as we became is that he did open up to me on camera in ways that he never had before. You know,
Yes.
He's written about his mother's suicide, although some people question whether it was suicide or an accidental overdose. You know, he's written about his experience during the war, but I think I got from him just a much deeper interview than I would have gotten if I were just a filmmaker who came up and scheduled a week of interviews. You know, his own kids who've seen the film and have been very nice about it were quite surprised that I got him to open up the way he did. So
and you're saying that was a virtue of all the time that went by, right? That the virtue is that you became, I mean, frankly, Bob, the film is so interesting in a way. You became sort of a surrogate son in a way. I mean, you know, the audience, only 200 people in the audience actually saw the film, and I'm going to encourage all of you on Friday to see the film either in a theater or on demand. It is a wonderful film, especially whether you are a fan of Vonnegut or not. It's just enormously interesting. And one of the things is what's interesting is that Bob saved any time Vonnegut called him, and, you know, on the old school answering machine, that was probably what Bob was using, those old school answering machines. He kept it. And so you heard Vonnegut's voice speaking to this filmmaker who was his buddy in a very familial way. And that's why I'm saying that I think that you would never have been able to get him if you were trying to accomplish this in 1 week. It required decades of a friendship that actually created, you know, the full opening up of Vonnegut in this film.
Well, that's why I say it became a very different film than what I imagined. Now, if I had the trade-off, if I had the you know, crystal ball, and I said you can either make a conventional sort of, you know, American Masters piece on this guy and be done with it in a year and a half, or you can spend 2/3 of your life, 2/3 of my life so far, you know, it's 39 years, and come up with something that's just kind of a richer tapestry and deeper. Would I have made that trade-off? I don't know, but here we are. It's done, and it is a much richer, and I would say a much better film, certainly a much more interesting film than that would have been. But I never in a million years would have seen it going the way it did.
Yeah, clearly not. So we'll come back to that process later. So you've made a career, not with Laurel and Hardy, but starting certainly with W.C. Fields. Obviously, the voice and the mental processing of funny people is something that's interesting to you and has always been interesting to you, obviously. And Vonnegut, it's interesting, is, you know, many people think of him as a satirical novelist, right? His novels are funny. Everyone who reads them actually feels that way. I'm wondering, but the other thing is that in this movie, he's laughing repeatedly. You catch him laughing throughout, and you don't make a big deal out of it. You just show him laughing a lot. In fact, even at the end, it's all throughout, and he has a great laugh, a really wonderful, boisterous, you know, original laugh, I would argue say.
It was a smoker's laugh too, because he
the Pall Mall
cigarettes. So sometimes it became a very, you know, coughing kind of laugh, and you didn't know whether to join in or, you know, give him the Heimlich.
So the guy that now we know of not only as the filmmaker of this great documentary, but as someone who's won Emmys for Curb Your Enthusiasm, obviously drawn to Vonnegut for similar reasons. Tell the audience, why is comedy so important to you? And why, in your mind, is comedy so important to our broader common culture? Because it's obviously something you've investigated a lot.
Well, I haven't given a lot of thought to the why. All I know is that as a kid, I loved comedy. I just did a podcast the other day called the Movies That Made Me. And people come on and talk about movies that were important in their lives. And this wasn't a hugely important movie to me, but I can tell you the first movie I ever saw, and I would have been 4 years old, was It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And so I was 4 years old, and all these great comedians, and my God, it was just a big experience for me. And so I loved comedy as a kid, and I loved, I'm just old enough to have caught the last few years of the Ed Sullivan Show, and of course there was the Carson Tonight Show. So stand-up comedy, some stand-up comedy, I was a very big fan of. And then what really changed my life, quite literally, in the same way that reading Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions in high school changed my life, but when I was in 8th grade, I discovered the Marx Brothers, and that was it. There was no turning back. I mean, I loved them. I was obsessed with them. Now, this is in the days just before home video. So it was a big effort to see their films. I had to go to repertory houses.
Yeah.
And I went through the TV guide every week with a yellow highlighting pen.
And you were of the generation, which is my generation, that really missed it, right? That if you didn't make the effort to watch the Marx Brothers, it's not like, you and I are over the age, there was no cable, there were no streaming services. This was something, there was no even VHS. So you were to really make an effort to discover something like this.
You had to make an effort. And I was lucky. I grew up in Fullerton, California, in Orange County, right near Anaheim. And in Anaheim, which was an easy drive, there was a place called the Old Movie Theater. And they ran these movies. And occasionally I'd come into LA, the city, to see these things. So a lot of these films I actually did get to see with an appreciative audience the first
with an
time.
audience, yeah.
There's a big difference. It's so much better to see it with an audience. That said, if you had told me as a kid that someday I could own all the Marx Brothers films for like $10 a pop and watch them whenever I wanted on a pretty good sized screen, and that the prints would be great, that's a great thing in itself.
And there's a really great irony in addition, is that when you wrote, on a fly to Kurt Vonnegut to say, I'd like to make a documentary, and you started off wisely saying, I just made for PBS a documentary about the Marx Brothers. The irony is he wrote you back when he finally wrote you back a month or so later, he said, I saw that movie and I really liked it, which is a nice coincidence. I think, if he not seen it, you might not have gotten the same response, right?
Yeah, so he said that. I mean, he was asked by people why he responded to me, when certainly he would have gotten other offers to do this kind of thing. And, we shared a love of old comedy. The Marx Brothers to me were sort of the gateway drug, so to speak, which led to Laurel and Hardy and W.C. Fields and Chaplin and Keaton and all the greats. And Kurt grew up on those films and loved them. So he just happened to watch my Marx Brothers film on his own when it was on. So by the time I wrote him and I said, you don't know me, but I made this film, he had seen the film, and it was one of the reasons that he got back to me, because he liked it. He thought, oh, well, this guy's a good filmmaker. It's not like I was just out of film school and looking for my first thing, and he was going to be kind of my professional guinea pig. He considered me a professional already.
So let's go back to the original question that I think you didn't quite get to, and you might not want to answer it. But in addition to the way that it changed your life, clearly you've devoted so much of your career to amplifying the voices of very funny people. And so I'm wondering whether it's not just that it's influenced you and that it's interesting to you, that I wonder whether you think it's just simply a very important cultural art form, whether it's in stand-up, whether it's the Marx Brothers, whether it's Curb Your Enthusiasm, that no matter how you package funny material and however it's delivered, it's important. It's a different style of opera.
Well, I do think it's important. At the end of the day, it's Sullivan's Travels. We can write off comedy as being kind of trivial, but it does improve people's lives, certainly. Now, that's not what's behind these films, when I make them, I'm not thinking in those terms. These are just artists I've admired. I've never done a documentary on anybody, a biographical documentary on somebody that I didn't admire a lot, who had a big impact on me. But to me, it's the same thing as like if you're a kid, well, when we used to buy actual records on vinyl and bring them home and play them, you might hear, in my case, like a new Beatles album or something. And I say, well, this is great. I'd invite my friends over to listen to it. Say, listen to this. This is so great. Hold on, listen to this guitar solo or whatever it was.
Right.
And to me, it's like, isn't
sharing
great? Isn't Woody Allen great? Isn't Kurt
Yeah.
Vonnegut great? I want to share them with the world,
Right.
so to speak.
Right. This is the way of doing it.
Yeah, this is just my thank you letter to these great artists, and a way of sharing my appreciation with them, with the world. And, if somebody sees this film and, they haven't read Vonnegut, and maybe they'll say, oh, he looks interesting. I'll have to pick up Slaughterhouse-Five or Cat's Cradle, then all the better,
Yeah. So life intervenes all these years that go by where you're filming him. The finances, of course, are at issue. One question I have is, in the movie, I don't think there's ever a point that Vonnegut turns to you and says, for the love of God, my friend, we started this when you were a kid, and this is going into decades. Are you going to make a movie about me or not? Did he ever complain, or did he actually enjoy the fact that you were chronicling his life and you were going to eventually do it?
It's an interesting question. And we actually had a section in the film at one point which just wound up on the cutting room floor for no reason other than length. And you have to kill your darlings. And this was a darling that got killed. Is I did get a fax from him one day that basically said, let's pull the plug on this. And it wasn't mean, it wasn't nasty. He had no ego. So he thought, oh, if I make this film, that's great. If I don't make it, that's fine too. He really didn't care. By that time, our friendship had really taken over.
Which was the primary connection at that point. Sure.
I mean, as I say in the film, there was a point where, up to a certain point, I sort of worried about how the friendship might impact the film. And then it got to the point where I was worrying about how the film might impact the friendship. It's like, he invited me to his country place, on Long Island, Sagaponack, for a week.
And you didn't film that?
I didn't film it because I wanted to just hang out and not have a camera crew there.
Right.
So it really turned around that way. But I've now derailed my own train of thought. I forgot.
No, it started when I said the darling on the cutting room floor.
Oh yes,
where he says there is a discussion about are we doing it or not?
Right. So what happened was he did send me a fax once, basically saying, because I had asked him about another interview, about something was coming up, and I thought, well, maybe I should film it. And I asked him about filming it. And he did say, look, if you don't have enough footage of me by now, what are we talking? Why don't we drop it? And he did suggest we pull the plug. But when I called him and I said, well, no, that's not going to happen. You think I'm just going to give up on this after all this time? And I did say, look, it's fine. I don't have the interview anymore. But what came to light was that he thought he was letting me off the hook. Yeah. And I, after all these years, was saying, oh, I can't believe I'm still having to do this thing. He wanted to let me know that if we stopped, it was okay with him.
You'd still be buddies.
We'd still be friends, and to not worry about it. So once I cleared that up and said, no, this would be a catastrophe not to see this to completion.
Yeah.
We were back on track. And I think I probably did even film him a little bit after that,
but he must have realized, I mean, in some ways you may have not actually produced this while you were continuing to develop it, but you were, I would say, taking batting practice with Vonnegut all throughout anyway, not just in developing this project, but I think you adapted a short story into a one-act, what I would say an off-Broadway play that appeared in Los Angeles. I think it was even starring your wife, who's an actress. What was it? Was it a short story of his? And then I was going to say,
now you've got Laurel and Hardy, and you've got this.
I missed.
You got one more thing.
Yeah. And then we cut this off.
Yeah. And we can't.
Well, so what was it that you adapted?
There were two projects that we sort of collaborated
because
on.
he wrote plays as well.
He wrote he did write plays. And in 1970, he wrote a play which opened initially off Broadway, then moved to Broadway, called Happy Birthday, Wanda June. And it was oh God, don't let me forget his name now. The actor who was in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Kevin McCarthy, and Marsha Mason were in the stage version, the original version, and
And in fact, in the movie, if I remember, you actually have a photo of him in front of the theater.
yes, the Delise, is that how it's pronounced? Delise Theater.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And so in any event, we so that was in 1970, and that's what led him to leave Cape Cod and move to New York. It ultimately broke up his marriage. That's a whole nother story. But in 2001, my wife and I were on the phone. And my wife was an actress at the time, and my wife and I were on the phone with him. And my wife, who they adored each other, Kurt and Linda.
Yeah, that's in the film.
Linda said to him, "What do we have to do to get you out here?" Because he hadn't visited Los Angeles in some time, and we always had dinner. He'd come to our house and have dinner. And he said something very unexpected. He said, "I'll come to LA if Bob directs Happy Birthday 1 to June and you play the Marsha Mason one."
Right. In fact, that scene is in the film, right?
Yeah, and we did it.
Yeah.
We put on the play. And then a couple of weeks before we opened, 9/11, 2001.
Yeah, and that's why he never made it. But I mean, but Bob, he didn't say, when Linda asked the question, he didn't say, "Tell your husband to finish this movie." He didn't say, right?
Like I said,
He came up with something else that in fact involved her. And then I was going to say another example of true batting practice. The impulse, I'm not sure where it came from, but you actually did adapt one of the novels, Mother Night, into a feature film that you wrote the screenplay. And I think I mentioned to you before we went live, I actually wrote about that movie. I really like that movie. It stars Nick
Yes, I was
Nolte.
relieved to hear that it was a positive review.
Yeah, no, I really liked it. I have a very good, strong memory of actually seeing a screening in New York of the film because it was due in 2 days. So what I'm saying is that there were other ways that you were getting into the head as an artist for you of Vonnegut without actually finishing the documentary. You were doing other things that were creative in their nature, but were in and around the world of Vonnegut and his work.
Well, yeah, the film at a certain point just became sort of a background thing, like, background music when you're doing something else, and something that I would put in time here and there. And he was, up until he said, "Why don't we forget it?" He would make himself available. And I took him back to Indiana. We walked through his childhood home, which his father, an architect, had designed, and took him to his high school, his grade school. And then there were often, and then his promotional appearance at the Borders in Manhattan, the flagship store. He did a promotional appearance there for Timequake in 1997. I filmed it. So he would do public speeches, and I would just show up and film, but it was always kind of in the background.
Yeah, but Mother Night, right? That film, where did the impulse for that come from?
Well, one of my very best friends is a fellow named Keith Gordon, who was an actor who had started to direct, and this is purely coincidence.
Yeah, this is the Rodney Dangerfield film.
Yeah, Keith Gordon played Rodney Dangerfield's son in Back to School, and there's that famous moment where he opens up the door and there's Kurt Vonnegut at the door. Well, that's Keith at the door.
And then Keith eventually directed the movie that you wrote.
Right. Well, Keith and I remained, best friends, and I wasn't directing yet myself. I was writing, and we wanted to do something together. We were friends. We wanted to make a movie together. So I said, "I'll ask Kurt for the rights to one of his books. Maybe I'll get it on a handshake." Wow. And we can develop it. And we did. And we decided on Mother Night because it could be made for not a lot of money, because it's a fairly contained story. There's no space travel or time travel or spaceships or intergalactic wars or anything. It's basically a World War II story.
But it had the same politics of Slaughterhouse-Five, though.
Sure. I mean, it was pure Vonnegut, but in many ways, probably his most conventional book and his most adaptable book.
Yes.
So we figured we could do it on a relatively low budget. So Kurt gave me the rights on a virtual handshake. There was no money exchanged, and it took us 5 years to raise the money, but we did. And Keith, I wrote it. Keith directed it. We both produced it, and Vonnegut is in it.
It's a great, yeah, and that's true. He's in it. It's a wonderful film, and what I loved about it, among other things, again, it had themes that we've explored through Slaughterhouse-Five and we're going to get to in a second, because we're going to get to our Dresden questions. Vonnegut's life, one of the things that you bring out is a really good example of a journeyman artist who, doesn't want to take on conventional work and is encouraged to keep working. And, he was not an overnight sensation. This is really a very, I think, very, optimistic film about perseverance and about pursuing your dreams as an artist. And I think the film, surprises people, because they always assume, that people just landed with Slaughterhouse-Five or something like that. And all of a sudden you're on the New York Times, bestseller list. And in fact, you point out that Vonnegut slaved away at, conventional work. He was a publicist for General Electric. He was a car salesman, things that seem improbable, right? He worked for Sports Illustrated. I don't think he ever actually wrote anything for them.
No, he worked for them for like one day. He sat down and gave him an assignment. He just said the hell with it and typed a sentence and walked away from his typewriter.
But in many ways, I think, again, it's an encouraging film in that way about well, that's how Vonnegut got started. Oh my God.
Well, yes. I mean, he was a struggling writer, and then he wasn't. He was an overnight sensation. Yeah. And what's interesting, sort of, is the parallel between his struggles, certainly his career overall until Slaughterhouse-Five, but the struggle, the effort, the rewriting, the rethinking that went into Slaughterhouse-Five because he just couldn't crack the code. And then the parallel thing that I'm going through, trying to get this film made and not giving up after 39 years. There's a parallel there that's hinted at in the film that's kind of interesting. But he after his experience,
you mean the 20 years that it took him to actually write Slaughterhouse-Five and the 39 years it took you to actually produce the film?
Right. Yes. Right. And always working on it in some fashion and always struggling. But what's interesting is once he left his publicist job at GE and decided he'd be a full-time writer, he was actually making a very good living writing short stories.
Yes.
When you could make a good living writing short stories, because there were so many magazines that were buying them and paying what was
an interesting anecdote that you say in the film, Bob, where you say, or someone says, in the 1950s, short stories was like television.
Yeah, it was the television of the day. It was the center of the so-called entertainment industry. Everybody got the Saturday Evening Post or Collier's or whatever, and you would read. Kurt said you would read all the short stories and then hand it to your brother or your sister, or your father. It would, would circulate through the family. You would all read the stories, and your friends read them too. Just like, well, now TV is so dispersed, but just like a popular TV show that the next day
that everybody had watched and talk about the next day at school.
Right. And then what happened was TV actually did emerge and killed
the killed the short story.
Right. So Vonnegut had to go back to writing novels, which, the advances were okay money, like, $2,500, which was a nice.
And it took a year or more to write.
It took him a year and a half to write it. So he always had to get other jobs. And what's amazing to me is, Player Piano didn't really sell. Then came The Sirens of Titan, which to me is an amazing book.
Yeah.
And then Mother Night and Cat's Cradle. And God bless you, that you could write all these books and still have to sell sobs to put food on the table. It's incredible to me. It's like, what have you got to do to succeed as a writer, that you can write Cat's Cradle, which became kind of a cult book on college campuses, but he still had to teach or take other work or whatever. It's amazing to me that you could write books that good and still be struggling. Now, when those books came out initially, they were like pulp fiction, like you find in those rotating book racks that you used to see in bus depots and drugstores. What happened was, and so they sold very little. Some of them weren't even reviewed. Many of them were paperback originals. But what happened was Slaughterhouse-Five then kind of exploded, became.
They used the same cover design.
Right, but then then they went back and they reissued those books, and that's when they sold.
Yeah, and then everybody won.
They sold. Right. They were written before Slaughterhouse-Five, but they sold after Slaughterhouse-Five.
Here's a great anecdote from the documentary Unstuck in Time. One of your talking heads is the novelist John Irving, who's really great in the movie, by the way. But I remember many years ago, Irving writing an essay in the LA Times Book Review, and he said, you'll love this. He said, he said he was talking about literary culture now. He said, I would never have gotten to The World According to Garp if I was coming up now, because my first 4 books just did not sell well enough. And I would not have been able, they wouldn't have given me a chance to get to that 5th book. And I was reminded of that as you described it, that said, essentially that's what happens with Slaughterhouse-Five, right? He's slogging away on 4 novels that are great, but no one has read them until later, then they get reissued. Tell me what you think, because you came to him by reading Breakfast of Champions. What in your mind makes him such an important American novelist? You've converted this story into a documentary, but you came to him as a reader.
Well, it harkens back for me to what you were talking about earlier, was with regard to my love of comedy, is, Breakfast of Champions is a very funny book.
Yeah.
It's a very irreverent book, very iconoclastic, a very satirical book. So it was a perfect book for me in high school to read. So I came to him through his humor. And, there are those illustrations, those sketches all throughout the book. It's a very unintimidating book. And I've talked about, not in the film, but I've talked about sort of spinach literature, the stuff that you read because it's supposed to be good for you. And you kind of slog through it saying, well, I guess it's important to read Moby Dick for some reason. And then, you look at Breakfast of Champions and say, oh, this looks fun. This is pure entertainment. Now,
right.
Still taking on important issues, the big issues, the existential issues. Why are we here? What's our purpose? How are we supposed to treat each other? Why do we treat each other so poorly? Why the hell is there something like war and
in easily digestible way,
and
right?
All filtered through this kind of Midwestern Hoosier sensibility and sense of humor, always funny. So, to me, now, I don't think Vonnegut is just for high school and college kids. I love him as an adult, and many people do, but most people discover him in high school.
Yeah.
And that's because he's asking the questions that you ask in high school. Some of us are still asking those questions, by the way, but most of us discover him in high school. And to me, the appeal, I can't speak more broadly, I can only speak for myself. For me, the appeal was his ability to take on very serious, heady, profound issues, but always keep it simple and keep it funny. And John Irving, who you just mentioned, was a student of his at the Writers' Workshop
in Iowa.
And he says that Kurt's lesson to his students was, it's okay to be a serious writer and to be entertaining. And beyond that, he said, in fact, if you're going to be serious, you damn well better be entertaining.
So
I think that accounts for his appeal on such a broad level as that.
So you adapted one of the films that you thought was adaptable, right? One of the novels. But, unlike other writers who have sort of lumped at the same time where films got adapted, like Joseph Heller's Catch-22, right? Where they were, I'm just saying, given the fact that you're a filmmaker as well, I'm wondering, was there something in what you described about the narrative strategy of how Vonnegut unloads these novels that don't make them necessarily, easily adaptable? I wonder whether you think there's something about that you and your friend Keith found the one that you thought, this we can do because it's got like a through line and it doesn't go backward in time. It's not postmodern in that way.
Well, you'd be hard pressed to find a bigger Vonnegut fan than I, and yet I'm the first one to say that not all of his books should be movies. In fact, most of them shouldn't be. Mother Night struck me as an adaptable book, and it stays very true to the book. And I always thought that both Cat's Cradle and Sirens of Titan could make good movies, but not much more. And there are screenplays floating around for any number of his books, and they've been floating around for a long time. And a couple of his other books have been adapted, and I think I can go out on a limb. I think the statute of limitations has passed, and it said that they're not very good, in my humble opinion, and didn't do very well. I mean, Mother Night made no money at all, but it sort of got a certain amount of respect. So yes, now what Vonnegut said to me was that his generation of writers were not thinking of screenplays when they were
Yes.
writing their books.
Right.
His contemporaries, Heller and Jerzy Kosinski and William Starr. And by the way, they've all had, and Mailer and Gore Vidal, all have had, or most of them have had, really wonderful movies made from their books, and some clunkers as well. But they weren't writing with that in mind. And he was telling this in the 90s or the 2000s, that, current writers sort of reverse engineer from the film.
Think of it in terms of a movie. Right.
Yeah, it's almost like they're novelizing a screenplay.
Right.
And
hoping to sell it as
big money in the sale to Hollywood and all that. But he didn't write with that in mind, and consequently, most of his books are not very adaptable. So people are always trying.
Let's talk about Dresden for a moment. We're coming near to the end of this and hope to get some questions from our audience. To me, Dresden opens this film. It feels like it's the rosebud of this Robert B. Weide movie, for a lot of reasons. You open with it, you keep coming back to it. For the audience who doesn't know, but I'm sure everyone globally watching this tonight knows that Vonnegut didn't just write about Dresden in Slaughterhouse-Five. He was, in fact, the POW. His entire unit was wiped out, a squadron or platoon in the Battle of the Bulge. He was taken as a prisoner, and he was held as a captive in a slaughterhouse in Dresden. And so he survived the bombing of Dresden. And so
underground, we should say.
Underground, where you could survive.
Deep underground, which is
where you could survive. And then, of course, he walked out as a young man to see this incredible carnage and wreckage. And so one of the themes of this documentary is that he keeps, no matter how many times that Bob tries to get through to him, he keeps minimizing what Dresden meant to him. And he does it all throughout the film. And it's almost as if, Bob Weide doesn't believe him. And so he wants to push him, it seems to me. He makes it seem, I think at one point he said something about the neighborhood dogs may have had more influence on me than Dresden. And that line just did not resonate at all, right? It's one thing to say my mother's death or my sister's death, but the neighborhood dogs. So, is it that he was, unself-aware? Was he, was this engaged in an act of self-deception? Clearly, this was a defining point in his life. And when he finally got to terms with it in a novel, and apparently he wrote like 500 different versions of Slaughterhouse-Five, as if to say he was never able to really get into it. But when he finally did, it changed his life and it changed American literary culture. And this was something that obviously had more effect on him than the neighborhood dogs.
Yeah, well, yes, he always downplayed the impact of Dresden on him. And that line about the dogs in my neighborhood informing my character more than anything that happened in Dresden. His own daughters hear that and they say, oh, he's full of it. He's in denial or whatever.
Yeah.
I can understand what he's saying in a way that, I don't pretend to, understand his psychology exactly, but I think a lot of us tend to underplay, big events. And if he were to tell you his take on it, he would say that his interest in Dresden was more journalistic. And by the way, he did come up, from writing for his high school paper and for the Cornell Sun when he was at Cornell, and thought of himself as a journalist. And what surprised him was he survived this incredible, catastrophic event during the war and came back to the United States, figuring that people would know about it or talk about it. He'd read press about it, like as if, similar to Hiroshima. And there was nothing about it. It was like it never happened. And he said, how can nobody know about this? Or, maybe there's a little thing in the paper, I don't know. But so his take on it was, I was there, I saw this, and I'm going to report what I saw. So now, whether we can take that literally or seriously, I don't know. But that was his take on it, was I saw this, but he kept trying to tell the story of what he saw in Dresden, kept trying to approach it from different directions, and just could never get a beat on it. But all the time from the time he came back from the war until he finally wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, was always trying to find a way to write about Dresden. He couldn't crack the code.
This is so interesting what you're saying, because this is not really in the film, what you're saying now, because yes, you're saying he can't believe that no one's talking about this. And I'm thinking, Kurt, how obtuse can you be? There's a reason why no one wants to talk about this. And it's interesting, Bob, you don't go there here. And I'm fascinated by this. You don't really get into the politics of why it was even controversial for Kurt to build a novel around Dresden. Günter Grass, I don't know how much of this you know, but Günter Grass, the Nobel Prize winning novelist in Germany, did the same thing that Kurt Vonnegut did. And this is a guy who wrote Tin Drum and was obviously sympathetic to the horrors of the Nazis. But he too said, well, what about Dresden? What about Dresden? And the answer is, well, killing the Nazis or killing even civilians that supported the Nazis don't count. And that to raise the question, at least that's the perception in our country. This is why people don't study it. They're saying the Nazis killed 30 million Russians, 6 million Jews, 5 million homosexuals and gypsies. Really, we're going to really focus on 25,000 civilians in, yes, a beautiful city. And Günter Grass was a German. He got in trouble for saying not only about the killing of Dresden, but also, I don't know if you know this, the rape of of German women by Soviet soldiers. And that's another issue that no one is allowed to talk about, the rape of German women by Russian soldiers. So I'm just wondering, was this intentional that you said, I don't want to get into that? Because when I hear you say he was surprised that no one was writing about it, I think to myself, well, there was an obvious reason why no one was writing about it.
Right. But I mean, this was at the time, we're looking at this with some amount of hindsight. This was a 22-year-old guy who had just come back from this experience. And it was a major thing that happened. And he's at 22, he's pulling bodies out of people's basements and piling them up like firewood and torching them. And he's seeing tens of thousands of bodies. Now, the actual body count is a bit controversial, but certainly tens of thousands of bodies.
Well, because wait, can we just tell the audience about this, Bob? Because in Slaughterhouse-Five, he says something like 136,000 dead. And I think historians now believe it's more like 25,000.
There's still controversy about
really?
It. Yeah, but how much does it matter? It's like, well, all right, it was only 35,000. It wasn't, I don't know. It's a lot of bodies. And he was a young kid who had to clean it up.
But by the time he publishes Slaughterhouse-Five, and by the time it becomes a New York Times bestseller, there's much more distance, right? 20 years have gone by. And yet the issue about building an anti-war novel around Dresden was for some people controversial.
Right, but Dresden was just happenstance. Again, it was something that he happened to witness. If he had, he was also in the Battle of the Bulge, where the greatest loss of Allied lives within a single battle. I mean, within a contained battle.
In fact, I think he says his entire unit was wiped out.
Yeah, pretty much. And he came out of a hole, like this, and was marched into a train and then brought into Dresden. But you've got to understand too is that the whole question of who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. And I'm not talking about Nazis versus Americans or anything like that. But just as far as now, this was the raid was primarily British forces with aid from the United States, Allied forces. But he was on German ground. His own people were bombing him. In other words, if their mission had been fully successful, he would have been killed by his own people. He just happened to be in this deep, deep underground, cellars, the slaughterhouse, and survived. But so the whole question of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are is sort of turned on its ear when your own people are ostensibly bombing you, trying to kill you, or not caring whether they kill you or thinking about you one way or another. And also, this sounds, kind of funny, kind of trivial in a way, but his father and grandfather were architects, and he paid a lot of attention to architecture, and architecture was very much on his mind.
Yeah.
And the only city he had seen was Indianapolis, where his family built a lot of the
And
iconic
Dresden
buildings.
was, so well known as
Oh
a
my God,
gorgeous.
Dresden was beautiful. He was in the train looking out the window as a prisoner, saw this city through the window. And
It's in the movie. You actually have him say that, right?
Yeah, the word that came out of his mouth was Oz. It just looked like a
Oz.
fantasy
Yeah.
city.
Yeah.
And the prisoners are being marched through the city, and he's looking around at this, Florence on the Elbe, just beautiful, beautiful buildings. And he says there wasn't a cracked window pane, when he came into the city. And then whatever it was, 3 weeks later, he says, there was nothing left of it. You might have been walking on the surface of the moon. So he's not thinking about the politics of it at all. He's thinking about it as a personal experience of something he witnessed, where a beautiful city disappeared and all the people in it.
I see. In the movie, at one point, and I think you say it tearfully, you say, "I owe him this." And this, I want to have you answer that with a question that's from our audience. This person says, did he ever express any regret that he knew that he would not get to see the movie before he died? Now, I'm wondering whether that question presupposes that he knew there's no way Bob is not eventually going to make this movie. I mean, he must have believed at some point this movie would get made, right?
I guess so, but it goes back to what I said before, which is I don't think he cared much one way or another. Fine if I made it, fine if I didn't make it. He saw very early, not even I wouldn't even call it wasn't nearly a rough cut. It was really an assembly of clips that we showed in New York at the Museum of TV and Radio, which is now the Paley Center.
Yeah.
And he came and showed up. We did a Q&A afterwards. So he got to see a very, very early iteration of it. But this is what I'm saying. As the more time went by, the less the film was on his mind one way or another.
And it was
so it wasn't like
supplanted by the friendship.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So I don't think he cared. And I'm just, when I say I owe him this, I don't owe him anything because he's gone. He has no idea what's going on. And really didn't care when he was alive, let alone now. But I owed it to the friendship, I think. He was so gracious with me and gave me so much of his time and so much of his attention, and it opened up to me so much that it would have been wasted not to bring it out to the world, so to speak, and to have people enjoy. I've said that if people watch this film, which is 2 hours and a couple minutes, if people watch this film and come out of it feeling like they just spent 2 hours with a really interesting, funny, intelligent guy, like they just had great company for 2 hours, that's pretty good. And I really wanted to share him.
Well, you definitely achieved that, Bob. Here's another question from the audience. Who owns the Vonnegut's original home now? Did they lose it in the Depression? Which I think in the film you point out that I think they did lose it in the Depression. I know that they moved from, there's a footage of him moving. And then it says, and later, was he able to buy it back? And or is it a landmark now?
No, it's not a landmark. In fact, I think the owners were trying to sell it a few years ago and were having trouble selling it. No, they when they moved out of that house, apparently somebody brought this to my attention because Jerry Klinkowitz, a Vonnegut scholar and a friend of Kurt's, says in the film that they lost their home and had to move into a rental property. And some woman in Indianapolis very forcefully told me, no, they didn't move into a rental property. They actually traded houses with somebody. Somebody bought their house and they traded houses or bought a smaller house. So they were able to put away a little bit of money from the sale. But the point is that they couldn't stay in that beautiful house. So they moved into a smaller house. And then after that, Kurt's dad bought a place in Williams Creek, Indiana, which is outside of Indianapolis. And that's where they lived until Kurt's mother died, and then his father moved to Brown County, which is near Bloomington, Indiana. But no, I don't think there was so much sentimental value in the house that it was like a big catastrophe to not live in that house anymore. Now, the person who bought it, I can't remember if they bought it from the Vonneguts or if it was the next buyer, was a pretty famous Indiana architect named Evans Woolen. I can't remember where the S goes. But Kurt said that his father was very pleased that it was another architect who bought the house. By the time we went in '94, it was owned by a very nice couple who obviously let us into the house and knew we were coming, and let our camera crew.
Did they even, by the way, did they realize they had bought
Oh,
Vonnegut's
sure.
truck?
Oh,
Right,
sure.
okay.
Absolutely. No. The history of the house was quite well known. And then they sold it to somebody. And in fact, when I go back there after Kurt's death around 2017, because Don Argett, my co-director, and I happened to be in Indianapolis to film some other things, I wasn't intending to go back to the house. He said, let's go back to the house. Maybe we can get on the property. And at that point, the house was for sale. We just wandered onto the property. So Don got a lot of footage of me sort of looking around and reminiscing all these years later without Kurt. And it's actually a pretty moving part of the film. But at that point, the house was up for sale and was vacant.
The Vonneguts in the film come across an enormously interesting and complicated family. I mean, the siblings, right? His brother, his sister, and also the impact that the whole Vonnegut clan, there was a lot of them, especially since they were builders and architects, had on Indianapolis, right? I mean, they were
very much so
seminal in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the family dynamic was interesting. And God bless Bernie Vonnegut, Kurt's older brother. He had all these great 60mm home movies that he kept in a closet. They were pristine and clean and unscratched, and loaned them all to me. And I transferred them to videotape. And you see Kurt from like the age of 2 years old on through his adolescence, and with his brother. But his brother was a very famous atmospheric scientist, as famous in his line of endeavor as Kurt would become. And his sister was truly his muse. And sort of, Kurt says, she taught me what was funny. We shared the same sense of humor, the same jokes. And she's
and like the sacrifice that he made with her children when she died and her husband died, that he ended up taking in there, was it 4 boys or 5 boys? Yeah,
there were 4 boys, and one was a baby at the time who eventually got farmed out to another relative. But yes, they had, the Vonneguts were raising their 3 children, and then we won't go into the specifics. They'll see that in the film.
Yeah.
But suddenly, Kurt and Jane's 4 nephews were orphaned when their parents died through unrelated tragic circumstances. And so Kurt and his wife
took them in,
kids and raised them as their own. So
and they're interviewed throughout the film, so you get their perspective as growing up with this, extraordinary, stepfather.
This grouchy old guy at his typewriter yelling at them to shut up for playing too loudly in the yard.
So the film opens this Friday at the IFC Theater in New York and other locations, and someone just wrote a note saying this film must be seen, which is the perfect thing for a director to hear. And then she says, when will it appear on PBS? I assume at some point it will, but it will be streamable at some point.
I'll tell you quickly the life of the film is that this Friday, November 19th, it opens up in more theaters than I ever expected. Still, it's not a Marvel film, so it's not everywhere. I should suggest to people, there is a Facebook page. Just enter Kurt Vonnegut Unstuck in Time or Kurt Vonnegut documentary. You'll wind up on the Facebook page. I'm constantly updating that. And just yesterday, put the current list of theaters. You can actually scroll down and see if it's in your town. Now, if it's not, or if you're not ready to go into theaters yet, VOD, video on demand, on all the major platforms, Amazon, iTunes, wherever you rent. So
anything that we're watching now, binging, you could actually insert the title and it'll pop up.
Yes. So the same day it opens, Friday in theaters, it's also on VOD. It'll play out on VOD for a while. Eventually it winds up on Hulu down the line, because the distributors, IFC Films, have an output deal with Hulu. That's where it will go at the end of its life, but it'll be quite available until then. And I actually asked today about the rental price on VOD, because sometimes those things get very expensive, and it's not terribly expensive. It's quite affordable, especially if you watch it with your loved one or loved ones.
Yes.
And by the way, if you don't like it, I will pay you back.
See, that's the material of a comedy director. He showed us some Curb Your Enthusiasm joke. There's so much more that we could have talked about. I really wanted to talk about comedy and what is appropriate, because Larry David's show, oftentimes, skirts on what people are finding like, wow, can you make fun about that? What's too soon? Is there anything ever forbidden? And the reason I wanted to ask you that question is because Vonnegut didn't seem to care about that, right? I mean, he was pretty adventurous in his comedic imagination, right? He wasn't worried about.
I think the most creative types are, they're not terribly concerned. Will this go over? Will this sell? Will they like this? Will this offend people? You just, I mean, I did a film on Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce just said what was on his mind and paid the price for it.
Yeah.
You know, that's what great artists do. By the way, you mentioned Curb Your Enthusiasm. I'll put in one final plug. You know, I used to direct for the first 5 seasons, most of the episodes, 5 or 6 out of the 10 every year. Now I just come back occasionally and do one episode for the season, but the current season that's running, it just so happens this Sunday, November 21st, is my episode of Curb for the season.
Great.
And so
watch it this Sunday.
This weekend is like a Weide weekend.
Yeah, this is a Weide
coming on Friday, and my Curb episode on Sunday.
And you were on FOLCS on today, on Wednesday.
Yes, it's a very full week.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we say goodbye to Bob, do we have any closing announcements? I think we've got just the remind people to go to our to our folks.org page and sign up for our email list. We've got lots more programming before the end of the year that we'll give you notice of. And of course, in the turn of the year, we'll have more films and more conversations. And we hope to have Bob Weide back again for something else. Bob, this is a really wonderful movie. It's an incredible achievement. As I said in the beginning, it was sort of a buddy film. It's a love letter, a Valentine. You know, you really honored your friend beautifully. And I think for the person who asked the question, does he regret? I don't think that, I think that Vonnegut, from what we saw of him in your film, knew that he put his story in the right hands of the right person. I think that there's no doubt that he felt a certain connection to you, and that is why he opened up to you in such ways that even his own children were surprised. And so that is, you know, to be able to touch someone at that level, which in the movie you describe how extraordinary it was that you ended up being buddies with your idol or a hero, a literary hero. But you know,
we all have that fantasy about meeting somebody, in the public eye creator, that
Mickey Mantle,
becoming friends with them. It never really happened.
Yeah,
and in my case, it happened, which was really odd.
But in this case, I think that Vonnegut found a kinship with you that was profound, and I think that you gave him something as well. You gave back. So I just want you to know that's at least one person's perspective on what you shot.
I appreciate it. Let me just leave you with this note: is that if it takes me 39 years to make a film, I'm 62 now, I probably only have 1 or 2 left in me. So we'll definitely catch up the next time.
Bob, we have all kinds of series that we could bring you back for that doesn't require something that you just made. So you'll see. I have an idea for you one day. So that's why I want to write to you about this. Okay. All right, Bob, thanks again for joining us at FOLCS. For the audience, please see this movie. It's a great movie. You'll be enormously entertained. And yes, if you're not already a Vonnegut fan, you will be. And it really is a story of, one of the important American writers of the 20th century. There's no question about it. Until next time, I'm Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Good night, everybody.